Okay, here we go again, and this talk is about moving the goalpost for when Einstein says 1 equals 0. So I looked at a talk by this person, Stephen Bryant, and the full talk is at that web address. And given the maths that Einstein has presented, you can end up with the conclusion that 1 equals 0. And this was shown by Stephen Bryant. And when I saw the video, I thought that it was good, because it looked to me that it was highlighting an easy way to understand that there is a problem with the mathematics of Einstein. But that is not really taking into account what some people are like. Going by Einstein's mathematics, we can end up with 1 equals 0. And obviously Einstein could not have really meant that 1 equals 0. And it seems to me that most people then want to try to work out what he really meant, instead of accept that he gave 1 equals 0. And that is really moving the goalposts. So moving the goalposts is to change things so they don't end up with the result of 1 equals 0, and instead end up with something more sensible. So restating it, most people seem to want to think Einstein didn't mean 1 equals 0, and so try to reinterpret what he presented. Often they don't realise what they're doing is moving the goalposts. So first of all, let us look at the maths that Einstein gave us. And this is a recap from what Stephen Bryant has pointed out. These are the equations of Einstein, and what we need to do is to see whether these equations are consistent with each other. And as an example, you can choose the value t equals 0, v equals 0 and x equals 0, and put them into the equations to see what that works out to be. When you substitute v equals 0 into this equation for beta, you end up with beta is equal to 1, and then you substitute that into the other equations, and that leaves you then those equations becoming what is shown there. If you then substitute t equals 0 and v equals 0, x equals 1 into that, you end up with tau is equal to 0 and the other Greek letter as equal to 1. So we end up then with this Greek letter is either equal to 1 or 0, well actually it's both 1 and 0. So the values of t equals 0, v equals 0 and x equals 1 gives this Greek letter as being equal to 0 and 1, which is a bit of a contradiction. It's like saying that 1 equals 0. Now Einstein could not have meant that, so we have to try to work out what he really meant. One simple proposal is that Einstein did not mean t, v and x should be allowed the values t equals 0, v equals 0 and x equals 1, i.e. there are restrictions on the values of t, v and x. So now we need to look at the issue, are there any restrictions on the values of t, v and x? Here is the usual translation we refer to for the 1905 paper from Einstein on special relativity, and I have complained in other places that this has not been properly translated, but we can ignore that issue for now. Einstein ends section 3 of special relativity paper deriving the Lorentz transformations, and says nothing about any restrictions on the values of x, v and t and the other variables. And this is where he's written it. And if we go to Wikipedia, Wikipedia gives the Lorentz transformations in a different notation without any restrictions on the values of v, x and t. You look at that, those are 4 equations there. There's nothing about any restrictions on the value of what those equations can be. And so based on that, there are no restrictions being placed on the values of t, v and x. In Einstein's paper, there is no mention of restrictions, and in Wikipedia there is no mention of restrictions. And if you go to other texts, they seem to give no restrictions as well. So the values of t equals 0, v equals 0, x equals 1, that leads to saying that 1 equals 0. They are valid values for t, v and x. However, if you go back to the derivation of the Lorentz transformations in section 3 of Einstein's paper, then maybe he is imposing restrictions on the values of x, v and t and the other variables. So this is section 3, which section 3 is about the theory of the transformations of coordinates and times from a stationary system to another system in uniform motion of translation relative to the former. And it goes on for several pages before deriving the Lorentz transformations. So he eventually gets to this, where he has the equation x squared plus y squared plus z squared is equal to c squared t squared, and he's going to do a transformation into the other equation which has the Greek letters. And what he's doing here is doing a transformation of one sphere into another sphere. And what he's doing is he's talking about a spherical wave moving out, and he's imposing conditions on that. At the time, this is what he's saying, at the time t equals tau equals 0, when the origin of the coordinates is common to the two systems. Let a spherical wave be emitted therefrom and be propagated with the velocity, which in polymeter speed, c in the system k. If the coordinates x, y, z be a point just attained by the wave, then so and so forth. However, I contend that when he gets to here, he has finished giving the proof for the spherical waves. So what he's done, he's got made a transformation from one coordinate system to another, and he's claiming this is dealing with spherical waves. But when you get to the bottom here, where he says this shows that our two fundamental principles are compatible, that's when he's finished dealing with the spherical waves. And supposedly after that proof, he derives the Lorentz transformations. And then he goes on to talk about this in the equations of the transformation which have been developed. There enters an inequality of theta of v, which we'll now determine. So he goes through on doing that, and that then leads to the end of section 3 by him saying the following equations. And there's no mention of any restrictions on the values of x, v and t when he does that. However, this is where the argument with different people can now begin. if we look at things differently. I'm starting from this part where he's saying this: in the equations of transformations which should be developed, there enters a known function theta of v, which we'll now determine. And I'm treating that bit onwards as the derivation of the Lorentz transformations. But from another point of view, you just continue to impose the restrictions from earlier where you've engaged for the spherical wave proof. Now, the spherical wave proof, well, people have complained that's not quite right as well. There's mistakes in that. But you see this in section 3, there's the two parts: the spherical wave proof and then the Lorentz transformations derivation. And if you're splitting it in two different ways, you are not then going with the people who are merging the two things together. And the point of view where they're merging the two parts together, the spherical wave proof and the Lorentz transformation derivations, doesn't make sense to me, because if we now look at the Lorentz transformations as they're usually presented in text nowadays, such as the Wikipedia, there's no mention any restrictions on the values of x, v and t and the other variables. But as you can see, there is now a difference in opinion as to how to interpret Einstein's mathematics. Einstein ends his derivation of the Lorentz transformations without stating there is any restrictions on the values of x, v, t and the other variables. And texts that come after him, such as Wikipedia, do not state any restrictions on the values of x, v and t as well. But in the section 3, that Einstein has for deriving the Lorentz transformations, in the first part of that section 3, he has restrictions on the values of x, v and t, which has been dealt for the spherical wave bit. But it's not clear whether that part is to be then carried on to the rest of section 3. As far as I'm concerned, Einstein has been ambiguous. He has not made himself clear as to what he is doing. This ambiguity means that although it can look like Einstein is saying 1 equals 0, the goalpost can be moved and a different interpretation placed on what he's saying in section 3 can be made. Obviously, Einstein did not mean 1 equals 0, so that would mean that the Lorentz transformations would have restrictions, conditions placed on the values of x, v and t and the other variables. But that is not how the Lorentz transformation is being presented nowadays, such as in Wikipedia. So it's goalposts being moved if you want to put restrictions on them. What Einstein means has become a problem of how to interpret and reinterpret him to try to make sense of what he's saying, because he has not explicitly explained himself very clearly. And so it can lead to this idea of going down the rabbit hole. And this is from Alice in Wonderland. When she falls down the rabbit hole, things just get bizarre. When you fall down the rabbit hole, things just get crazy and crazier. And this is a result of ambiguity that Einstein has created. Because, for instance, x and t, are they supposed to be independent or dependent variables? If they're independent variables, then x and t can have any value independent of the value of the other. Whereas if they're dependent variables, then the value of x is dependent on the value of t, say by the equation x equals ct. And Einstein is not stating whether they're independent or dependent variables. In other words, he's not saying if there's any restriction on them. If they're dependent variables, then there's a restriction being placed on them. So then if t equals 0, by using the equation x equals ct, you end up with 0. And if you use the value t equals 1, then by using the equation x equals ct, you end up with 1 also. i.e. the value of t restricts what the value of x is. Then the Lorentz transformations, which Einstein writes as that for when it's x dependent on t by x equals ct, then that equation becomes as the following, which is 1 minus v over c all times t, and that becomes then by x minus vt equals c minus v all times t. That then becomes these equations here. And so is that what Einstein is supposed to mean? Part of the problem is psychological people. When trying to convince them that Einstein is wrong, instead of accepting that information, they instead try to work out what they think Einstein meant, and they then think they know what he meant. So when pointing out an omission in what Einstein said, they would try to fill in the blank. When that happens, it then seems impossible to convince them. In this case of 1 equals 0, such people can convince themselves that Einstein did mean that restrictions should be applied, and insist on believing that even if it is pointed out that Einstein is making no mention of applying any restrictions. I.e., I think their point of view boils down to shouldn't interpret Einstein away to get 1 equals 0, because that is nonsense. So you can't convince them of anything. Whereas going by the information Einstein gave, and that leads to 1 equals 0. Thus Stevens-Bryant's proof that Einstein's relative wrong because it gives 1 equals 0 can fail to convince everyone, which I find very disappointing, because on first encountering it seems a very simple way of highlighting there's something wrong with relativity. Trying to work out what Einstein might have really meant just takes you further down the rabbit hole to more craziness, as you try to make more amendments to correct his mistakes. It is a nice, easy piece of maths showing that Einstein has 1 equals 0 in it, but it just then leads to various people coming up with what they think Einstein should have meant when he stated that mathematics. And then what they're doing is they're moving the goalposts. As I pointed out in previous talks, the mainstream, i.e. establishment, keeps sweeping certain things under the carpet. And this is where you can get the extra information from, and this is the end of this talk, I'm afraid. And it's pointing out it's very hard to convince people. If you're looking at Einstein's paper on special relativity, you're finding there are things that can be interpreted in different ways, and so unfortunately Stevens-Bryant's simple bit of mathematics showing that based on what Einstein's saying that 1 equals 0 fails to convince many people, because they are trying to make allowances for what Einstein is saying and try to think it means something different. Thank you. The end.